A freakishly thin and tall black suit-wearing entity lurks in the darkness and stalks his victims, often children, in the internet-born myth known as Slender Man. The story of this disturbing character struck fear in the hearts and minds of kids all over the world. Centuries before, young people were aware and afraid of an entirely different menace. In an etching by Spanish artist Francisco Goya, a hooded figure, haunting in appearance, stands before a woman and two very frightened children. This artistic piece was published in 1799 under the title Que viene el coco, which loosely translates in English to Here Comes the Boogeyman. The Boogeyman legend, specifically El Coco, was well established in Spanish society, hundreds of years before Goya presented his interpretation of it. However, the depiction of this walking nightmare stands as an important historical reference to one of the most recognized figures in Mexican folklore, that we in the American Southwest would come to know as El Cucuy, a name that has become synonymous with all things terrifying. In my family, whenever an adult mentioned El Cucuy, it meant something extremely dangerous was near. Exactly who or what that something was, oftentimes was left up to our imagination. The nondescript nature of this entity made it all the more frightening. El Cucuy could take the shape of anything: a stranger standing on a street corner, a passing shadow in the hallway, or a creature hiding under your bed. Man, monster, or something in between. This ancient legend, along with the haunting of La Llorona, the spirit of a woman condemned to roam the land of the living for her children in areas near rivers and lakes, were just a few of the many stories I grew up listening to. My elders used to call them los cuentos. They would recite these creepy tales by memory in a way that captured my attention more effectively than any scary movie or TV show ever could. In today's episode, I will be sharing some of these stories that were once passed down to me many years ago, including the bloody and scandalous legend of Juan Oliveras, also known as El Tiradito. Welcome to episode 2 of El Presidio Project.
Uncovering the creepy side of the old Pueblo. This is El Presidio Project. Strange Tales of Tucson.
Hello all, this is Dini once again, back with another episode of El Presidio Project. Before I get things going, I'd like to thank all of you who checked out the premiere episode earlier this month. I really appreciate all the nice things you had to say and for sharing it on your Facebook feeds. Hopefully, you'll enjoy this one as well, and you'll continue to spread the word among your friends and family. So since the last time I had a chance to speak with everybody, I had a birthday. I was able to spend some time with family down in Southern California, and during my trip, I went on a tour of Old Town San Diego called Ghosts and Gravestones. I'll be talking more about that later on, but the whole experience really fits nicely with today's topic, which is all about urban legends. Hopefully in the future I can venture out to other places and bring back some information that I can incorporate into this podcast and share it with you all. But for now, I'll leave you with a few of my favorite stories that once circulated throughout Tucson's Mexican-American community a long, long time ago. These are the urban legends of my elders. Here is episode 2, Los Cuentos. It was said the ultimate evil once came to Amado, Arizona, a rustic town located about 40 miles south of Tucson. The humble ranch home of a family struggling to survive under the shadow of the Great Depression was chosen as the meeting place between a young girl named Amalia and the devil himself. The old-timers used to say when El Diablo appeared at Amalia's bedside on that fateful night, her screams could be heard throughout the countryside. Earlier that day, the young girl had cursed her kind and dutiful mother. Her words were so cruel and vicious, Amalia became cursed the moment she said them. which prompted the devil to come from the depths of hell to claim the rarest of prizes, the soul of a child. The encounter stirred up an awful scene. Witnesses who responded to the young girl's cries claimed something had grabbed a hold of her that caused her body to levitate a few feet off the bed she was sleeping on. A chilling detail associated with demonic possession that would be featured in the horror classic The Exorcist some 40 years later. Amalia's parents and neighbors watched in absolute terror as the young girl yelled and clawed at a presence only visible to her. It's believed the devil left Amado that night without claiming the young girl's soul, for reasons that vary from divine intervention to the power of forgiveness and unconditional love that a mother feels for her child, which can overcome just about anything. However, one part of the story remains the same, regardless of who's narrating the tale. Amalia lived out the rest of her life with an expression of fear on her face as the result of her meeting with the most evil one of them all. Years later, the story of young Lorenzo, known as Lencho, a resident of a local barrio, captured the attention of both young and old alike. According to the legend, after a very public dispute with his mother, Lorenzo became furious. As his mother walked away from the confrontation, the young man, consumed by rage, picked up a round stone off the ground and threatened to bash his mother's head in. Appalled by her son's insolence, the woman turned to her boy, with tears in her eyes, and pleaded with him. If he harmed her in any way, surely he would regret it for the rest of his life. Unmoved by his mother's words, Lorenzo approached the woman, stone in hand. Suddenly, without warning, the young man collapsed. He screamed in agony, clutching at his hand. The legend states Lorenzo and the stone became one that day. As a punishment for his transgression, Lencho's stone became permanently fused to his hand. The young man was cursed with the burden of having to carry the very thing he had threatened his mother with, forever. Obviously, stories like this one and young Amalia's encounter with the devil were utilized to discourage children from disrespecting their parents. But not all legends with cautionary messages were geared toward little kids. Others were intended for adults, such is the case of Juan Oliveras. Tucson's urban legend about Mr. Oliveras began to circulate throughout Barrio Viejo and beyond sometime during the late 1800s. The story was believed to be based on fact rather than fiction due to its lack of supernatural beings like ghosts, monsters, and demons. So much so, the city council agreed to officially grant landmark status to an area dedicated to the fallen Oliveras, known to local citizens as the Wishing Shrine of El Tiradito. A newspaper article dating back to November 8, 1927, states a woman by the name of C.B. Perkins came forward with the real story of Juan Oliveras and presented it to the gentlemen of the city council. According to Mrs. Perkins, her father, Dr. F.H. Goodwin, knew Mr. Oliveras personally. Goodwin had hired the man to work as a sheep herder on his ranch located a few miles north of Tucson. Soon after, Dr. Goodwin agreed to employ two other members of Juan Oliveras' family, his young wife and his father-in-law. At some point during their stay at the Goodwin Ranch, Juan became infatuated with his mother-in-law, who lived in a home located on Meyer and Simpson Street in Tucson. Juan's frequent visits to the Southside residence caused his father-in-law to become suspicious. One day, the man followed Juan to Tucson. When he entered the home, he discovered Juan and his beloved were having an affair. The man violently threw Juan out of the house, and in a fit of jealousy and rage, reached for an axe that was near a woodpile and brutally slaughtered the young man in public. Juan's murderer fled to Mexico, never to be heard from again. Meanwhile, word about the slaying and the scandalous reason behind it quickly spread throughout the neighborhood. The men and women of the barrio, shaken by the incident, reached out to the Catholic Church for help. But the church refused to take away the body, citing Juan's act of adultery prevented them from burying a sinner on holy ground. Juan Oliveras' body lay discarded, hence the alias El Tiradito, which means the throwaway. That night, the community pulled together and buried Juan right where he fell. The elders began to light candles and pray for his soul to be forgiven. If they prayed hard enough, maybe one day Juan would be allowed into heaven. As the years went by, the people residing in the area came to believe if you visited the shrine dedicated to El Tiradito and offered him a prayer by candlelight, which served to illuminate his journey, Juan's grateful spirit would grant you a wish in return. While there are many versions of the story out there, which only adds to the mystery of this Tucson urban legend, the version I just presented appears to be somewhat consistent with the wording on the historical marker found at the wishing shrine, which reads as follows. This is the only shrine in the United States dedicated to the soul of a sinner buried in unconsecrated ground. It is affectionately called El Tiradito, the castaway. The many legends about its origin all involve a tragic triangle love affair in the early 1870s. The mysterious powers of El Tiradito are still an important part of local Mexican lore and culture. Nearly 150 years later, people still come to the place known as the Wishing Shrine, which now stands on Main Avenue and Simpson Street, to light candles and offer prayers to the fallen Tiradito. If you grew up listening to this story and would like to share another version of it, or maybe just tell me about a recent visit there, you can find a photo of the shrine on El Presidio Project's Facebook page where you can add your comments. Coming up next, the Weekend Creepshow Report. This is the part of the podcast where I discuss movies and other stuff related to the horror genre. Today, I'll be talking about two very excellent documentaries about urban legends, a not-so-excellent movie based on one, and my recent visit to the infamous Whaley House of San Diego.
The good, the bad, and everything in between. It's the Weekend Creepshow Report.
Sticking with the whole urban legend theme here, I'm going to start off with Small Town Monster Studios' 2017 documentary, The Mothman of Point Pleasant, which is available right now on Amazon.com. If you're unfamiliar with the Mothman legend, it basically states that from November of 1966 to December of 1967, a creature described as half bird, half man was spotted in and around Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The numerous sightings of the Mothman seemed to end after the tragic collapse of Point Pleasant's Silver Bridge that resulted in the deaths of 46 people. This led many to believe the Mothman was some sort of supernatural omen of what was to come. Others think it might have been alien in origin due to the sudden appearance of men in black around town. The Mothman mythology is covered nicely in this documentary, including interviews with eyewitnesses and some pretty cool graphics and animation. It's about an hour and 10 minutes long, so if you're up for a short documentary, definitely check it out. Another documentary film that I saw recently, for the second time, is one of my all-time personal favorites, based on today's topic. It's 2014's Killer Legends, written and directed by Joshua Zeman. Zeman is most known for his 2009 documentary called Cropsey. Cropsey is absolutely amazing as well, but the subject matter might be a little too dark for some people. Definitely worth a look. However, if you're a fan of horror films as well as urban myths, Killer Legends is excellent because it talks about both. In it, Joshua and a researcher named Rachel Mills go on a road trip trying to uncover the origins of stories that we've all heard about. The Hookman, the babysitter and the stranger calling from inside the house, the ever-popular killer clown legend, and the Candyman. Killer Legends also features tons of interviews and footage from films like The Town That Dreaded Sundown and When a Stranger Calls. You can find Killer Legends right now on Amazon.com and Hulu. Also available on Hulu is 2012's The Haunting of Whaley House, a movie based on the place I toured a few weeks ago. This low-budget horror film is basically about a group of curious 20-somethings who decide to break into the famous San Diego home to go ghost hunting. They're later joined by an amateur paranormal investigator and a psychic. Of course, things don't go as planned, and chaos ensues. The history of the Whaley family was pretty spot on, but that's about the only nice thing I can say about this film. It wasn't the worst I've ever seen, but it was pretty bad in my opinion, which is a shame because this could have been a decent movie if the storyline wouldn't have been so predictable. The actual Whaley House, considered to be one of the most haunted houses in the United States, was built in the mid-1850s on the grounds of San Diego's old public gallows. According to the tour guide, Mr. Whaley, for whatever morbid reason, had the construction crew build an archway in the home to mark where the gallows once stood, a decision he would later regret after the spirit of a man named James Robinson began to haunt the Whaley family home. In the following clip you're about to hear, my group and I were standing at Mr. Robinson's gravesite, while the tour guide offered the following account of the crimes and the punishment handed down to this legendary figure of San Diego, known as Yankee Jim.
Now, you guys, he, at a point in history, stood 6'4" when the average person stood maybe 5'4". 5'2" to 5'4" was the tallest we used to stand back then. So like, if I were to take my heels off, that's how tall I would be. Actually, it's probably how tall I am right now with my heels on. But you see, he was like the Yao Ming of his generation, really. So he was. He stood head and shoulders above everybody. So he shows up here in a 10-gallon hat and a gun on his side, very intimidating presence, and he had a deep voice from the northern part of the United States, and, well, people didn't know what to think about him, so they just kind of left him alone. He eventually made friends with some unsavory characters, and him and those two people would end up in the worst trouble of their lives. In fact, they would give their lives because of it. Well, at least he did. Now, they would get caught for trying to steal from a fleet of ships in the harbor. First, they had to steal a couple of horses and then a rowboat to get out there. They didn't know that the boat belonged to the brother of the mayor. Now, on paper, he was being tried for the theft of the horse, but in the eyes of that city, he was being tried for the theft of that boat. Because his brother, on the other side, was a judge. So, the theft of a horse is a grand larceny punishable by death. The form of execution we chose in San Diego was the gallows. The gallows stood right where the Whaley House stands today. In fact, he would be the last person hung in our city. It would be because his execution went horribly wrong. In fact, the city of San Diego just didn't want to deal with the stigma attached to the hanging tree anymore. You see, on the day that he would hang, they would lead him from the sheriff's office, which was right here, down the street with Thomas Whaley's wagon. And then when they got there, they would put him on the back of the wagon. They'd put the rope around his neck. They smacked the ass of that horse, and when the horse took off and he fell off the end of it, his feet still touched the ground. The executioner forgot to measure that length of rope twice and never took into consideration the extreme height difference between him and everybody else. In fact, he was alive for almost 45 minutes that day, the end of that rope. The average process, unless you were lucky enough to have your neck break immediately, would take 15 minutes. They would end up leaving Yankee Jim on the end of that rope for an additional 24 hours, just to make sure.
Along with the spirit of Yankee Jim, the Whaley House is said to be inhabited by the ghosts of the family themselves, including Thomas Whaley Jr., who was just 18 months old at the time of his death, and his sister Violet. Violet Eloise Whaley married a gentleman named George on January 5, 1882. The marriage only lasted 2 weeks. George abandoned his bride during their trip back from their honeymoon. Heartbroken and humiliated, the young Violet returned to her parents' home. She was shunned by society, which caused her to fall into a very deep depression. 3 years later, Violet took her father's .32 caliber pistol and shot herself in the chest. She died on the parlor room floor of the Whaley House on August 18, 1885. She was just 22 years old. So during my visit there, I didn't feel really creeped out until I got to the upstairs area that was used as a live theater venue. There were rows of chairs and a small stage where a traveling group of actors called the Tanner Troupe would perform. Something about that specific room made me feel a little uneasy. I didn't see or hear anything strange, but the energy in there was certainly different than the other rooms of the house. I would definitely go back and would recommend anyone visiting San Diego to visit the Whaley House. Before I wrap this episode up, I'd like to share something with everyone. I debated whether or not to include this clip because personally I don't think it's ghost related at all, but I've shared it with a few people and I've gotten different responses. So this was captured at around 8:30 at night while I was touring the El Campo Santo Cemetery, which is very nearby the Whaley House. The Ghost and Gravestones tour guide sort of let us wander off on our own to explore the grounds. I got out my digital recorder and started walking around. When I got home, I listened to about 5 to 6 minutes of nothing but the distant voices of the people on my tour and my own footsteps. It was pretty boring, until I got to this point. Here's the setup. You'll hear me walking around, and then you'll hear the sound of me whistling, which was me reacting to a grave marker I came across with the word hanged on it. And then something comes through that's either a bird, a seagull maybe, or a disembodied voice gasping for air. No, I'm not saying that's what it is. I think it's a bird. But just for fun, I'd like to know what you guys think. So the audio clip plays twice and then once in slow motion. Here it is. Bird or something else? Let me know on El Presidio Project's Facebook page or on Twitter. Thanks again for listening, everybody. I'll be back with another episode on July 23rd. Have a good one. Bye-bye.